Well, until this month, most Americans had never even heard of the Missouri city of Ferguson. Now the name Ferguson is known around the world for a very tragic reason. It's become synonymous with the use of deadly force by police against people of color. What's most heart-wrenching is that the death of Michael Brown is not an isolated case. In recent weeks, there have been other deadly attacks on black men. A huge demonstration this weekend in New York City was a public call for justice for Michael Brown and for Eric Garner. Garner died after apparently being put in a chokehold by a city police officer in New York. Michael Brown was shot multiple times after being told not to walk down the middle of the road. Ferguson police say he tried to grab the officer's gun. However, witnesses say his hands were up in the air. Eric Garner died after being arrested. His alleged crime? Selling untaxed cigarettes. While the protest march in New York was peaceful, in Ferguson, the police response to demonstrations included tear gas, armored tanks, and assault weapons. These are weapons and machines from the battlefields of the Middle East, now being used against American citizens. And for the latest on the mood in Ferguson, we're joined by Arise News Washington Bureau Chief James Blue. James, the National Guard are being withdrawn, as you know. Now, does this reflect a change in the atmosphere there?
Yeah, there is a distinct change in the atmosphere, Julian. I'm right here at the spot where the young man, Michael Brown, was shot. And it turns out last night there were fewer protesters out. Everything they did was very, very peaceful. And there were people out talking to each other, sitting on their lawn chairs, and just enjoying their company. The National Guard is no longer a real presence here. The State Highway Patrol has taken over, but we are here out on the streets, and we really have not seen any law enforcement the entire time we've been in Ferguson this morning.
Now, of course, James, the White House has chimed in. As you know, and many know, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder visited Ferguson this week. And, of course, we understand at the funeral tomorrow that 3 representatives from the White House will be at that funeral. How was Eric Holder received?
The Attorney General was received quite warmly because it was an indicator that the federal government, the entire United States, is taking the incidents here very seriously. The fact that the president is sending 3 representatives to the funeral is another indicator that the violence and the threats that the communities here, specifically the black men here, are experiencing and undergoing both here and around the country. The administration wants to do something about it, and that's why they're sort of taking this very, very, hands-on approach to follow and monitor these cases.
James, real quick, we've also witnessed recently some folks in support of the police officer, Darren Wilson. Have there been any friction between both groups of protesters?
You know, the rally that was held in South St. Louis yesterday in an area where there are a number of law enforcement people who live there, it was really distant from the town of Ferguson. I think there's a real sense, regardless of what happened, that this guy was doing his job, and that was the purpose of the support rally for him in South St. Louis yesterday, that he was doing his job and he therefore should not be held up as a pariah as a result.
Okay, we're going to keep our eyes on this. Arise News Washington Bureau Chief James Blue. James, thank you so much for that insight and report. Sadly, the stories of Michael Brown and Eric Garner are not unusual. Pamela Newkirk is a professor of journalism at New York University. She's also the author of Within the Veil, Black Journalists and the White Media. And joining us from Washington is Spencer Overton. He heads up the Joint Center for Politics and Economic Studies. I want to welcome both of you here. And Spencer, I want to start with you first. Attorney General Eric Holder certainly seems to acknowledge the injustice, but what can he really do about it?
Well, you know, he did go, and he has certainly been stopped himself, but he went there as the Attorney General to Ferguson. And there's a civil rights division of the Justice Department that's currently investigating, along with 40 FBI agents and the local U.S. Attorney's Office there in Ferguson. So the Justice Department brings lawsuits, brings claims against police departments, either when there's an excessive use of force, and that might be the case here, they're just trying to do a fair, impartial investigation, or if there's a pattern or practice of improper behavior by police officers.
Pamela, I want to bring you into this. You know, even while there was another black man shot and killed by the police not far away, the police gave one account, but cell phone video basically contradicts that story. We're living in an age now, perhaps, where social media is running ahead of even reporters and journalists.
Absolutely, but as we've seen in the past with Rodney King, right? This was a police beating that was on camera. The whole world saw it, and still there was an acquittal of the police. So while I believe that social media and cell phones and all of that can help, I'm just so afraid that so many people have these fixed and warped views of African American males, and even what they see is not enough to convince them that officers have this predetermined bias against young black males.
Pamela, you make a very good point. You're talking about video that seems quite obvious to most of us, even the Eric Garner case where the police officer puts on what you could not dispute. It was a chokehold, but even the PBA president, Pat Lynch, came out and defended his officers nonetheless. Tish James, who's the public advocate here in New York, came out promoting using cameras by police officers, saying will save the city a lot of money. Right. But what we witnessed in Ferguson was a police officer with an assault rifle using expletive deletives against protesters, knowing the camera was right on him.
Exactly.
So it seems like cameras don't make any difference at all.
Exactly. And in the early days of the rioting, I actually felt that maybe for once America can really see just how bias works against African Americans. But even now, all of the polls are showing 57% of blacks, 18% of whites believe the shooting was unjustified. 71% of blacks, 31% of whites believe police are more likely to use deadly force against African Americans. So even with all that we've seen over the past 2 weeks and with the many horrific police killings of black men that have gone, without convictions, this continues, and it continues to divide us.
I want both of you to respond to this. I want to show you this picture. It's a front page of yesterday's New York Post, and we can get a close-up on this. Gentlemen, we can see this. It basically says here, as many marched today, we're talking about the march yesterday in Staten Island against the NYPD, we give our support to the New York's finest. Now, I'm bringing this up for a reason for my conservative and right-wing friends, always talking about Al Sharpton being the race baiter. You've got to admit, first of all, this is wrong. This was not a march against the NYPD.
Right, and I think the protesters made it clear, and Sharpton made it clear, that it was not against the New York Police Department. It was against that one officer who put him in an illegal chokehold.
Right, but it's the rhetoric that is put out here. And I must admit, in all disclosure, I'm an honorary chief with the NYPD, and I support the overwhelming majority of good cops. I don't support bad cops.
Exactly.
And that's what they're trying to say. But you get people, you get a paper like this that puts this out there, and you have folks that will eat this up like hook, line, and sinker.
But that may be a more blatant form of media bias, but I was more troubled by this morning's New York Times, where they had an article on the 4 hours that Michael Brown's body laid, in the open on the ground. And not only did they show his corpse, which is kind of unheard of in most mainstream media. In fact, it almost never happens, particularly of an American. There have been times when in war scenes they'll show, fatalities abroad as if it doesn't matter because it's further away. So I had a problem with that. But I also had a problem with, in the first couple of paragraphs, they said, well, while he was there for 4 hours and he was not treated, he probably could not have been revived. And there's no attribution. It just probably couldn't have been revived. Based on what?
Spencer, I want to come back to you. Of course, there was a lot of outrage, even amongst conservative media, about the overwhelming use of force against the protesters in Ferguson. Now, Obama, the administration says they're going to review this policy. What is your response to assault weapons, armored personnel carriers against predominantly peaceful protesters and the overwhelming minority of folks who are causing violence? Don't they have enough equipment to deal with that kind without using this kind of force?
Right. You'll remember in the aftermath of 9/11, there was a massive attempt by the federal government to get basically military-style gear, armor, automatic weapons, that type of thing, tanks, into the hands of local police departments. The thought was that local police departments will be the first responders. This is the first edge. These are the first responders in terms of terrorism. We see this unintended consequence, something that wasn't discussed back in 2001, which is actually these devices being used on civilians, peaceful civilians who are protesting here in the United States. And as you mentioned, now the president is ordering a review of these policies. Billions have been spent on getting military equipment to these local police officers. And some of the proposals that have been suggested to deal with this issue would be much more intensive training. So, for example, overseas, a lot of military, they don't point weapons when they go around. They have weapons down. So much better training as well as better inventory. I don't think that we have a good idea of where these weapons are and keeping track of them. And then there's just the general policy, do we need these? Certainly, Eric Holder was very skeptical of the use of this military equipment in this context.
Well, I tell you, we have so much more to talk about, but we've run out of time. Spencer Overton, Pamela Newkirk, we could have talked about black-on-black crime and how that's been used.
We could have talked about de Blasio and the broken windows policy.
Exactly. But we don't have time. I want to thank both of you so much for joining us. Great discussion.
Thank you.